They say the lighthouse does not just shine, it remembers. Tonight, its flame twists higher than ever, burning not light, but centuries of shipwrecks. Sailors clutch splintered wood, eyes wide with frozen terror, their screams folded into the wind. From the village below, you can see your own hands clawing at the waves. Taste salt that is not yours. Feel the cold water clutching your lungs. And when dawn comes, the lighthouse is gone. Only the blackened rocks remain, littered with bodies that have no faces, no names, but somehow, every single one of them was you. The lighthouse shivered before midnight, a column of fire that seemed alive, trembling with a breath that was not its own. Its flame did not reach the rocks, did not warm the cliffs, did not illuminate the dark sea with familiar gold. Instead it burned with memories, flickering with the wreckage of vessels long forgotten, timbers splintering in slow motion, sails twisting and snapping like the wings of trapped birds, and the faces of sailors frozen in the instant before they drowned. From the village below, the wind carried more than the usual salt and spray. It brought the acrid tang of burning wood mixed with the metallic bite of seawater, and beneath these layers, a faint, older smell lingered, like earth turned over 1,000 years ago, damp with decay, infused with the residue of what had already been lost. Every gust seemed to scrape against stone, sending whispers of names over the cliffs, voices long silenced, scraping like fingernails across the skin of memory, tugging at the villagers' attention with subtle insistence. The rocks beneath the lighthouse were slick with mist and foam, yet the villagers could see shapes moving within them, impossible silhouettes, bending with the curves of the stone, half human, half memory, dissolving into the dark until the mind tried to reconstruct what the eyes refused to hold. The fire pulsed in rhythm with the imagined waves, the collapse of hulls, the splintering of wood, a heartbeat older than the lighthouse itself, ancient and inexorable. Anyone who stared too long felt the air thicken, pressing against lungs, ribs, and hair, as if the flame itself reached out with invisible fingers, tugging, guiding, insisting that the living remember the dead. Shadows of cliffs stretched unnaturally across the village, cast by a light that should not exist, curling along walls and eaves, twisting into angles the mind could not follow, as though even the darkness was aware of the histories it contained. Salt spray clung to the skin of those who dared climb closer, mingling with sweat, the sharp edge of fear, and the faint, lingering sweetness of brine mixed with rot, a perfume that clung to hair and sleeves, embedding itself in thought. In the water below, the reflection of the flame revealed not the calm sea, but a panorama of collapse, sailors reaching for life that would not come, faces pressed against water and wood in panic, eyes wide with realization of what awaited them, mouths opening in silent screams that seemed to echo upward, merging with the wind and striking the cliffs with sudden clarity. The villagers heard it as a hum at first, soft and almost musical, then as a chorus of voices that could not exist, rising and falling in harmony with the fire, pressing against memory with a gentle but unrelenting insistence. No one walked the paths near the cliffs that night without sensing movement behind them, shadows brushing against their heels, brushing against the edges of perception, leaving tremors along nerves that had no name. The flame shivered higher, consuming nothing but attention, folding itself around the past until the present became unstable, as if time itself had been drawn into the lens of that unnatural light. Even the stones of the cliffs seemed to vibrate with the history held in the flame, groaning faintly under the weight of centuries, carrying the memory of waves breaking against timbers, of bodies thrown into the cold, unfeeling sea, of hands clawing for impossible grips. The air smelled of wet stone and old smoke, of salt, and the faint metallic tang of water mixed with what could only be the essence of loss itself, pressing into lungs with each breath, settling into hair, eyes, and bones. Every flicker of the flame was a tableau, a fragment of catastrophe, and every fragment drew the observer closer to comprehension, closer to the edge of participation, until the cliffside seemed less a place of safety than a stage, a vessel for the dead to replay their final moments, endless and insistent, a memory that would not release those who dared to watch. By the time the first stars appeared in the cold night sky, the villagers understood without knowing why that the flame demanded attention, and that it did not merely illuminate. It claimed, it pressed the living against the past with a force older than fear itself. The fishermen moved carefully over the slick black rocks, each boot leaving shallow impressions that disappeared almost instantly, swallowed by the sheen of salt and moisture that covered every surface like a living skin. The wind cut against his face with the sharp bite of ice and brine, carrying the scent of the sea, but also something older, fouler, something that belonged neither to water nor wind, but to memory itself. With every step he took, he felt the echo of another presence behind him, footsteps dragging heavy across stone that should have been empty, the rhythm of a march out of time, pressing close enough that the hairs along his neck lifted, though nothing existed to meet the gaze. His eyes, adjusted to the dim and unnatural glow that bled from the lighthouse above, caught glimpses of figures at the periphery, shadows that shifted too deliberately, bending into shapes that mimicked human form but were subtly wrong, grotesque, like puppets of catastrophe, rehearsing moments the living were never meant to witness. As he climbed, the sound of the waves crashing below became indistinct, replaced by the splintering of wood, the tearing of sails, the muffled screams of men who had been trapped on decks breaking apart, the noise folding in on itself until it was not sound but pressure, pressing into his chest, tugging at his ribs, vibrating through the soles of his feet and the spine of his back. When he reached a ledge closer to the lighthouse, the air thickened, heavier, almost viscous, carrying with it the smell of scorched wood, wet salt, and the iron tang of blood long dissolved into water, mixed with a faint rot that made his stomach clench. He could see the lighthouse flame now, burning with an intensity that seemed impossible, a vertical torrent of fire and smoke that did not illuminate but swallowed the light around it, twisting reality, bending the shapes of cliff and rock into angles that no human eye should endure. Then he saw himself in the fire, or at least a version of himself, younger, standing atop broken planks on a shattered deck, waves crashing over him, lungs searing with cold water, muscles trembling from exertion and panic, mouth opening in a scream that would never find sound. The reflection was perfect, mirrored not in glass or water but in the fire itself, the flicker of flame articulating every detail of the experience, pressing him to comprehend it fully. The spray-stung eyes that were his own, hands that were his own clawed at splintered wood, nails tearing against soaked rope, limbs bending unnaturally in the desperate bid to survive. He stumbled backward, his boots skidding across wet stone, heart hammering, lungs burning not from cold, but from a rush of terror that seemed to originate inside the lighthouse itself, as though the flame had extended tendrils into the world, grasping at awareness, tugging the living into the memory of the dead. Phantom footsteps followed him still, dragging and heavy, echoing across the cliffs, rising in intensity, merging with the imaginary roar of a storm that he could feel in his bones though the sky above remained clear. Every instinct screamed to turn and flee, yet the pressure of the fire, of the memory it held, kept him rooted, eyes locked on the vision of himself drowning in waves that never existed in the present but were rendered with perfect fidelity in the flame. The wind carried voices now, not whispers but declarations, screams of recognition, the names of men long dead, repeated over and over, layering with the crash of waves and the tearing of sails. Each syllable pressed into him as if physically, a tangible force that tugged at muscles and sinew, a subtle but insistent claim upon his body, insisting that he see, that he remember, that he participate. The flame shifted, and now the scene within it moved closer, bending the space between observer and observed, compressing distance until the fisherman could feel the sting of water in his hair, the splinter of wood against his palms, the taste of salt and iron on his tongue. Time became incoherent. A single heartbeat stretched to a minute to an hour, yet the fire continued its slow, deliberate pulse, replaying moment after moment of shipwrecks from decades and centuries past, folding each catastrophe into the next with the precision of memory itself. The rocks beneath him groaned with phantom weight, vibrating in sync with the scenes, each tremor pressing through ankles, knees, and spine, as though the cliffs themselves were aware of what the flame contained, a living archive of death pressed against flesh and bone. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, curling across surfaces, reaching toward the fisherman with subtle insistence. Fingers of darkness that mimicked the gestures of drowned men clawing at impossible grips, echoing movements he had never made yet felt compelled to mirror. The air around him thickened further, pressing against lungs and eyes, mixing the brine of the sea with the acrid scent of smoke, and beneath it all, the faint, older stench of decay, as if centuries of drowned lives had been compressed into a single, palpable presence. With each breath, he inhaled more than air. He inhaled memory, the pulse of catastrophe, the rhythm of the drowned pressing into sinew and marrow, inscribing the inevitability of participation. He could not avert his gaze from the fire, and each blink was mirrored within it, his eyes opening and closing under the same pressure, mouth parting and flexing as if submerged in water that had never existed. The flame shivered higher still, bending shadows and cliffs into geometries impossible to name, folding the world around it, compressing past and present into a single, continuous tableau. He felt the tug then, subtle at first, a current beneath his feet and in his chest, pulling him toward the cliff's edge, toward the fire, toward the infinite repetition of drowning that the flame embodied. He stumbled, hands scrabbling at rock, and in that instant saw himself fully consumed by waves, completely submerged, body pressed against timbers that were no longer solid but fluid memory, mouth tasting brine that belonged not to him, lungs filled with cold water of a time long gone, eyes staring into the nothing that awaited all who looked too long. The phantom footsteps intensified, now all around, surrounding him, echoing in a chorus of inevitability, pressing against balance and reason, a chorus he could feel pressing into bone, into sinew, into consciousness itself. The flame pulsed once, a heartbeat larger than his own, and in that pulse, the fisherman understood a simple truth. To look was to enter, to see was to become part of the endless repetition, to breathe was to surrender to the memory that would not release him. He collapsed onto the wet rocks, body trembling, soaked by spray that was not present, lungs burning with breath that was not his, and in that moment, the wind carried him into the fire, the lighthouse, and the endless, unyielding ocean of what had been, leaving nothing untouched, leaving no one unchanged, the cliffside vibrating with the slow, patient insistence of catastrophe folded into memory, pressing, waiting, consuming. Night fell over the cliffs, thick and suffocating, and the lighthouse flames shifted again, twisting higher, elongating, burning with an unnatural intensity that made the stars above seem dim, fragile, incapable of resisting its presence. It no longer simply flickered with memory. It replayed wrecks from decades and centuries past, as though the sea itself had handed over its history to the fire, folding every catastrophe into one continuous flood of chaos. Timbers tore apart with grotesque slowness, sails ripped in impossibly silent motion, ropes snapping with a subtle whine that pressed against the nerves of those who dared look, and the faces of drowned men, women, and children pressed against broken boards, eyes wide and mouths open in cries that carried not sound but a tangible weight. The waves below the cliff paused, frozen mid-collapse, water glinting unnaturally with bodies that shimmered between being and memory, their limbs bending in ways no human frame could endure, twisted into silent, deliberate choreography. The air carried the scent of brine and smoke, salt and burnt wood, mingled with an older tang. The musty odor of decay pressed into the lungs, pressing consciousness against the walls of the skull. Those who watched too long began to feel the rhythm of collapse inside themselves, hearts beating in precise harmony with the splintering of wood and the snapping of masts, lungs filling and emptying in time with waves that had long ceased to move yet had not ceased to drown. Shadows along the cliffs elongated unnaturally, stretching toward the flame, pooling and curling across stone as if trying to capture the fire's essence, forming shapes that mimicked the gestures of the dead, every movement subtly wrong, subtly cruel, bending perception into a taut, nervous tension that made the spine quiver. Every step taken by the living near the cliffs was mirrored by some impossible shadow, rising and falling in unison with the pulsing of the fire, pulling attention toward the chaotic flood that poured from the flame into the minds of those who dared look. The reflection in the surface of the waves became a mirror of suffering, faces overlaid on faces, limbs folding into limbs, sailors clinging to planks that dissolved beneath them, mouths opening and closing in a cadence that resonated in the observer's chest, pressing tendons, pressing nerves, pressing memory into muscles that had never known what they were being asked to feel. The flame itself seemed to pulse with purpose, expanding outward like a living entity, pressing against the horizon, bending space, compressing distance, drawing the present into the past until the living could not distinguish between what was real and what had been. The cliff rocks groaned as though aware, vibrating faintly beneath boots, under hands pressed to stone for support, synchronizing with the rhythm of water, wood, and fire, transmitting the agony of drowned centuries into sinew and marrow, pressing the heartbeat into rhythm with tragedy itself. Every gust of wind carried the layered cries of those claimed by the sea, overlapping, merging, repeating, sometimes faint, sometimes a chorus that swept across the cliffs with a physical push against the chest. Breaths became uneven, shallow, lungs tasting brine and iron that belonged not to the living but to the histories pressed into the flame, memories inhaled in a slow, deliberate instruction to participate in what was not observation but absorption. The night deepened further, blacker than memory, and the lighthouse flame flared with awareness, bending shadows along the cliffside into impossible angles, stretching the rocks themselves into unrecognizable forms, as if the world were being rewritten in slow, deliberate increments to match the choreography of the drowned. Faces in the fire shifted, eyes blinking in unison with those watching, lips parting with the same rhythm, bodies folding over one another in layered sequences that pressed against comprehension, forcing the living to feel what had happened to the dead in a cadence older than fear itself. The wind, carrying both the sound of surf and the echo of screams, pressed against ears, nose, and skin, embedding the rhythm of catastrophe into the senses, a pulse that could not be escaped, only endured. The fishermen who dared approach felt the water seep into boots that were never wet, salt stinging palms and necks that were untouched by spray, bodies aching as if they had been submerged for hours, days, or lifetimes. Each wave frozen in the fire's reflection told its own story. A captain clutching at a rope, knuckles white, eyes wide, limbs bending unnaturally as if the water itself had pressed them into shapes beyond nature. A crew trapped on splintered decks, twisting and stretching, mouths open, hair plastered to faces that were pale beyond life. Children clinging to fragments of timber, eyes liquid with fear, faces pressed against boards that would not support them, yet held them suspended, in the rhythm of inevitability. The flame pulsed, brighter, taller, bending over the rocks, pressing shadows toward the cliff edges, curling along walls, over ledges, dragging attention upward and outward, until the mind of any who watched could no longer distinguish self from what was being replayed, body from memory, present from catastrophe. Even the sound of his own heartbeat became alien, matching the slow, deliberate breaking of waves, the snap of timbers, the impossibly patient unfolding of ruin. Breath itself became a negotiation with history, each inhale drawing in layers of memory, each exhale feeding the tide of collapse, the rhythm of drowned flesh, the choreography of death pressing against consciousness. Stars above shivered, dimmed, and the night carried the scent of burning wood, salt, iron, and rot so thick it pressed into hair and eyes, embedding itself into perception with a quiet insistence. Those who lingered too long began to move involuntarily, limbs flexing, bending, mirroring the drowned below, muscles trembling as if in sympathy with suffering that had ended long ago, yet was performed endlessly in the fire. Shadows along the cliff twisted further, reaching across space and air to pull observers into the rhythm, curling into shapes that suggested hands, fingers, bodies pressing toward the flame, a choreography of memory and inevitability. The water below reflected nothing of the present. It was entirely past, entirely absorbed into the fire, each wave frozen, each body suspended, each expression of terror and despair replayed with precision that pressed upon awareness like a physical force. Time stretched into incoherence, minutes expanding into hours, hours into days, days into centuries. Yet the lighthouse flame continued its slow, deliberate pulse, folding catastrophe into catastrophe, layering memory upon memory, until the night itself seemed to hang in suspended terror, and the living, watching, could not resist becoming part of the endless, unyielding rhythm of the drowned, pressed into the choreography of history, of water, of fire, and of shadow that would not release them. The lighthouse keeper rose before midnight, a chill crawling up his spine like slow fingers of ice, and felt the cliffs beneath his boots tremble with anticipation, as though the rocks themselves were aware of what was to come. The wind carried not just the brine of the sea but the layered, insistent scent of memory pressed into stone, burnt wood, salt, iron, and something older, fouler, as if centuries of drowned lives had seeped into the cliffs and could not escape. Footsteps approached along the narrow, treacherous path, careful and hesitant, but as soon as they pressed against the wet rock, they vanished. The prints never remained, dissolved into the stone as though the world refused to acknowledge the living who dared approach. Shadows lingered longer than they should, trembling along the cliffside, twisting in subtle arcs that were neither human nor fully natural, curling over ledges, pooling in the cracks, resisting the logic of gravity and light, lingering as if reluctant to release the attention of those who had drawn near. Every sound carried the rhythm of drowning, a pulse that beat through the marrow of bone, the sinew of muscles, the delicate cartilage of ears, waves breaking, wood splintering, men crying silently underwater that no longer existed in the present but remained frozen in the fire of the lighthouse, pressed into the gaze of anyone who dared watch. The keeper lit the lantern in his trembling hands, expecting to cast a circle of safety, expecting light to chase shadows back to their corners, but the flame refused obedience. Instead of illumination, it projected a younger version of him, soaked to the bone, hair plastered to a pale, drawn face, mouth open in a scream that was both his own and not, eyes wide with recognition, recognizing inevitability, recognition that chilled him more deeply than the coldest wind. He reached for the glass of the lantern and felt heat where there should have been none, a subtle, living pulse emanating from the flame, pressing back against the palms of his hands, a slow insistence that knowledge could not be ignored. He watched himself clutch a broken plank atop a deck torn apart by waves, muscles straining, nails white against wood that threatened to splinter into impossibility, lungs burning from cold water that had soaked him for hours he could not measure, chest heaving in rhythm with the catastrophe that had already happened and would always repeat. The wind swirled through the cracks of the lighthouse, carrying the layered cries of those claimed by the sea over centuries, pressing them into the keeper's senses with deliberate insistence, brushing along his face and through hair, tugging at the flesh, whispering in pressure rather than words, murmuring in the language of inevitability. Each heartbeat became synchronized with the rhythm of catastrophe, a pulse that was not merely internal but transmitted through the stone, the air, the very cliffside that leaned inward as though alive, as though wanting to press him into the memory of the drowned. Footsteps outside multiplied and vanished, reappearing in impossible sequences, some distant, some almost underfoot, some directly overhead where the air thinned and carried phantom weight. Shadows of men and women twisted against the cliffside, elongating, flexing, imitating the movements of the drowned in a choreography that could not be unlearned once observed. He felt the tug of attention, subtle at first, in the soles of his feet, in the muscles of his forearms, in the vertebrae of his spine, a gentle insistence that he move closer, look deeper, fold himself into the pattern of inevitability, participate in the endless reenactment of drowning, collapse, and loss. The lantern flame twisted, pulsed, grew taller, reaching toward the ceiling, bending the shadows of his own body until it was impossible to discern where the keeper ended and the younger version of him began. The wet hair and trembling hands mirrored exactly, mouth open, eyes wide, a perfect echo of memory pressed into fire. Salt stung the corners of his mouth. Wetness clung to boots that had never left stone, chest heaving not from exertion, but from the rhythm of catastrophe, the choreography of death pressing insistently against sinew, muscle, and nerve. He could feel it in the air around him, the thick, pressing insistence of inevitability, the slow, deliberate accumulation of centuries of observation and absorption, of every visitor who had drawn near and vanished, leaving nothing behind but trembling shadows and footprints that never existed. The walls of the lighthouse itself seemed to bend inward, contracting imperceptibly, pressing the keeper's senses into the rhythm of the flame, echoing the pulse of drowned lungs, the splintering of boards, the tug of water on bodies that would never return to air. Every glance toward the fire forced a comprehension that was physical, mental, and impossible to avoid. Each wave that swept the deck in memory pressed against him. Each hand that clawed at splintered planks pressed against his hands. Each mouth open in a silent scream pressed against his chest, as though breathing had been borrowed, stolen, folded into the rhythm of the drowned. Shadows along the floor writhed in unnatural patterns, rising and falling, curling across beams, stretching along walls, forming impossible geometries, pooling in corners, as though the light of the lantern had released them from the prison of stone and memory, granting them will, attention, a subtle insistence to pull him closer, bend him into the fire, fold him into history. He pressed palms to the cool stone, knuckles white, fingers trembling, lungs filling with the salt and iron of the sea and the faint sweetness of decay pressed into the night, embedding him into memory that had no beginning and no end. Each heartbeat became a drum in the orchestration of catastrophe, each exhale a surrender to inevitability, each blink folding the present into centuries of drowned men and women, children clinging to fragments of timber, sailors pressed under waves that no longer moved, but remained suspended in fire and shadow. Footsteps still approached, sometimes beneath him, sometimes behind, sometimes echoing in impossible sequences overhead, pressing attention into nerves, muscles, sinew, embedding consciousness into a rhythm older than reason, older than fear. Every fiber of his body began to mirror the drowning, the freezing, the collapse, the splintering. Every thought bent toward comprehension of inevitability. Every muscle folded into choreography that existed before and beyond life. The flame twisted higher, pulling shadows with it, bending the walls, compressing space, pressing the keeper into the younger version of himself, until he was no longer merely observer but participant, folded into centuries of catastrophe, pressed into the pulse of drowned lungs, the tug of water, the inevitability of the fire itself. The air trembled with the weight of memory, the lighthouse vibrating with insistence, shadows curling in impossible angles, and the keeper understood fully, viscerally, that he was already consumed, his footprints dissolved into cliff, shadow trembling over rock, body and mind folded into fire, water, and death that would not release him, that had never released anyone who looked too long into the flame of what had been. The storm tore across the coast with a violence that seemed older than the hills themselves, waves lashing against cliffs with the deliberate weight of centuries, wind shrieking like the voices of those claimed by the sea, and yet the lighthouse stood untouched, a sentinel of stone and fire, its flame higher, sharper, alive with histories that pulsed through the night with impossible precision. Roofs of distant cottages were ripped away, timber splintered, and the smell of salt and wetwood filled the air, mingling with something older, darker, a tang of iron and decay that pressed into the lungs of anyone who dared look beyond their shuttered windows. The villagers huddled behind their walls, trembling in the rhythm of catastrophe, each gust of wind carrying not merely rain, but the layered cries of men and women long dead, a chorus that pressed against walls, against ceilings, against the fragile shelter of human flesh. The fire in the lighthouse pulsed like a heart not its own, bending the shadows along the cliffs into impossible geometries, twisting stone and wave, pressing against perception with subtle insistence, dragging attention toward it with the quiet inevitability of history itself. Those who dared approach felt the rhythm of the storm mirrored in their own bodies, hearts pounding in sync with the crash of waves, muscles trembling with the weight of drowned centuries, lungs tasting the salt of waters that were not theirs, mouths parting with gasps that echoed screams pressed into memory long before they had been born. The flame reflected not the storm outside but the catastrophes of the past, folding them into one unbroken sequence of ruin. Each wave, each splinter, each body pressed into the choreography of inevitability. Sailors clung to broken planks, faces pale and eyes wide, limbs twisting in impossible angles, all mirrored in the fire as though the living could feel the pull of the water through sinew and bone. Shadows along the cliffs writhed in response, curling toward the flame, stretching impossibly long, forming shapes that imitated bodies beneath the waves, yet subtly wrong, grotesque, bending perception and demanding participation. The villagers, unable to resist the pull, found their own bodies moving against their will, fingers curling as if gripping splintered wood, shoulders bending as though weighed by the current, knees flexing in rhythm with the collapse of decks, mouths tasting salt that was not theirs, hair plastered to faces pale beyond memory. Each exhale drew the rhythm of catastrophe deeper into flesh, each heartbeat pressed into alignment with the choreography of the drowned, a slow, patient insistence that attention alone was insufficient, that participation was inevitable. The storm outside became secondary, a distant echo to the more precise violence within the light. The collapse of history played out in exquisite, terrifying detail. Waves froze mid-break, water shimmering with impossible reflections, men bending over the rails, eyes wide in terror, children clinging to fragments of timbers, all pressed into shapes that could not exist, yet existed in the insistence of the fire. Breath became borrowed, lungs filling with histories not their own, muscles quivering under the weight of memory pressed into bone, sinew, and joint. The cliff rocks groaned, vibrating with the pulse of centuries, the tremor pressing upward through boots, into knees, into spine, a rhythm that could not be resisted. Those who looked too long felt their own bodies dissolving into the pattern, skin slick with salt, hair wet with phantom spray, teeth tasting brine and iron that was not theirs, eyes fixed on impossible scenes that moved in perfect, unyielding choreography. Even thought itself bent, folding into the sequences of the drowned, each memory overlaying the present, pressing the living into repetition, compelling the body to mirror what had been suffered long before. The fire twisted higher, stretching the shadows into forms that pressed along walls, rocks, and floors, coiling over edges, curling into impossible angles, bending perception so that the present and the past became inseparable. Every blink, every breath, every twitch of a hand was mirrored in the flame, in the frozen waves, in the drowned bodies suspended in fire and water, folding observer into catastrophe until there was no distinction between self and history, between living and dead. Screams echoed without sound, resonating through sinew and tendon, pressing into the chest, the stomach, embedding themselves in nerves, a silent chorus that could not be ignored, a rhythm older than any calendar, older than reason itself. One by one, the living began to move with the drowned, limbs stiff, soaked, bending and curling against will, bodies pressed into shapes impossible, mouths tasting salt that was not theirs, lungs burning with water long vanished, hair plastered to faces drawn with terror, and yet their own, and yet not. Shadows along the cliffs, no longer bound to walls or rocks, slithered across air, wrapping around limbs, coiling around shoulders, tugging attention, pressing bodies closer to the flame, ensuring participation, ensuring absorption into the choreography of catastrophe. The storm outside tore roofs and shattered timber, but inside the rhythm of history, the flame held absolute authority, past, present, and observer folded into one, each heartbeat a drum in the endless flood of the drowned, each breath a note in the insistent, patient music of inevitability. The villagers could do nothing but watch, or, if they dared approach, feel themselves swallowed into the reflection, folded into the fire, their bodies moving in unison with centuries of collapse, their senses pressed into the rhythm of ruin, until the line between self and history dissolved completely, leaving only pulse, salt, water, shadow, and the unyielding insistence of the lighthouse flame that consumed all who looked too long. The first light of dawn broke over the cliffs with a timid, pale gold, brushing against the rocks with a softness that could not erase the violence of the night. The lighthouse stood in silence, its stone blackened, the lantern gone, as if the flame had never existed, leaving behind only the faint tang of smoke, salt, and something older, fouler, a presence pressed into the very mortar of the walls. Villagers climbed the slippery paths to the cliffs, boots sinking into wet seaweed and jagged rock, hearts hammering with the residue of terror still clinging to skin and hair, fingers trembling as they touched stones that had been pressed into memory by countless disasters. The tide had withdrawn slightly, revealing a beach littered with bodies, sprawled and folded in positions impossible, limbs twisted as if the sea had played a cruel game of marionettes with the flesh of the drowned. Not a single face belonged to anyone who had disappeared in the previous months or years. No eyes reflected recognition, no lips moved in silent accusation, no hands clutched splintered wood that could have saved them. Each body was a mosaic of tragedy, a collage stitched together from centuries of catastrophe, pressed into the present as though the flame of the lighthouse had collected lives like scattered fragments and released them in a single, grotesque tableau. The smell of brine mixed with iron and decay pressed into the villagers' nostrils, thick and insistent, carrying a faint sweetness of charred timber and the bitter tang of water soaked into human flesh, a scent that would not fade with the rising sun. The cliffs themselves seemed to shiver in quiet awareness, rocks glinting wetly under the new light, their surfaces etched with tiny fissures that pulsed with a memory older than the oldest surviving villager, the pulse of catastrophe folded into stone. Silence hung heavier than any storm, broken only by the soft hiss of retreating waves and the occasional crack of timber settling or a gull landing awkwardly on jagged rock. The villagers' hearts beat in cautious rhythm, minds pressed into the impossible knowledge that the night had rewritten history itself, that the lives claimed were not simply lost but absorbed into a pattern beyond comprehension, folded into time in such a way that the present could never be free of it. Every glance toward the water pressed them into reflection. The waves no longer carried mere motion. They carried the imprint of countless bodies, a choreography of the drowned, shifting subtly as if the tide itself remembered the exact positions of hands, feet, and faces, a silent instruction in inevitability. The beach was a museum of impossibility, a ledger of lives that had never been meant to exist together but were forced into convergence by the fire that had consumed more than flesh, consuming attention, presence, and memory, leaving only the residue of catastrophe for the living to behold. And in the absence of the keeper, who had vanished alongside the flame as though pressed into the stone itself, the villagers felt the cold truth settle across their spines. The lighthouse had claimed not only the body but the past, folding centuries of disasters into the present, leaving each observer hollowed, each witness pressed into awareness of something larger, something eternal, something that could never be unseen or unraveled. Fingers itched with phantom pressure, ears still carried the faint echo of drowned cries, lungs tasted brine and smoke, and the shadow of inevitability pressed across the cliffs with subtle insistence, as if every heartbeat, every thought, had been recorded and folded into the rhythm of the night. None could leave untouched. None could claim ignorance. The horizon glimmered pale and indifferent, sun rising over a world forever altered, waves lapping gently against bodies that were not theirs, eyes staring blankly into eternity. The villagers turned slowly from the shore, carrying the weight of centuries pressed into the marrow, knowing that the night had not ended with the dawn, that the flame had claimed what was living and folded what was past, and that the lighthouse itself, blackened and still, waited silently for the next gaze, the next footfall, the the next curiosity that could not resist looking too long. Every rock, every grain of sand, every curling shadow along the cliffs whispered a quiet, insistent truth. The fire had not merely burned, it had remembered, it had claimed, it had rewritten the present, and the living, no matter how far they fled, carried within them the echo of catastrophe folded into bone, sinew, and thought. No one spoke, and yet the air carried understanding, heavy and patient, pressing the inevitability into every step, every pulse, until the cliffs themselves seemed to lean inward, folding the living into the absence left behind. Each villager shivered, a tremor that was more than cold, more than fear, a resonance of participation in the long choreography of catastrophe that the flame had conducted and released in forms that the living could neither unsee nor disentangle from themselves. And as the sun climbed higher, indifferent to suffering and memory alike, the blackened lighthouse remained silent, patient, eternal, its absence more present than any fire, its history folded into the world, claiming without violence, but with an inevitability far worse, leaving every living soul touched by its memory hollowed, haunted, and irrevocably changed.